In the sweltering summer of 1876, 41 tobacco workers vanished without a trace from the Beaumont plantation in central Kentucky. No bodies were discovered. No demands for ransom were made, and the sheriff's investigation was shut down after just 3 days by a sudden order from the county magistrate. For nearly a century and a half, the people of Bourbon County have whispered about that suffocating July night when an entire workforce simply disappeared from one of Kentucky's most prosperous estates. Official records coldly claim the laborers abandoned their contracts and fled north. But a cache of letters recently discovered hidden for generations within the walls of the old Beaumont Manor paints a very different and far more sinister picture. Those letters promise to overturn everything historians believed about post-Civil War labor in Kentucky. The Beaumont plantation was no ordinary farm. Sprawling across 3,000 fertile acres of bluegrass country, its limestone-rich soil made it a gold mine for tobacco. Founded in 1798 by French immigrant Claude Beaumont, the estate survived war after war and weathered the upheavals of the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the storm of Reconstruction. By 1876, it was under the control of Claude's grandson, Jeremiah Beaumont, a man admired for his sharp business instincts and his ability to adapt to a South transformed by emancipation. Unlike many of his peers who lost everything after slavery's end, Jeremiah embraced the contract labor system, paying wages and providing housing to freed slaves, Irish immigrants, and struggling white families who sought stability. That year was shaping up to be the plantation's most profitable ever, with a spectacular crop ready to fetch high prices in Louisville. The diverse group of 41 workers included men, women, and teenagers. Among them was Samuel Rutledge, a respected former slave who had risen to field supervisor Patrick O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who wrote hopeful letters to his sister in Boston. Martha Caldwell, a widowed mother of 3 who found safety and work after tragedy, and Thomas Vance, a young mountain farmer searching for a better life. The Beaumont plantation was like a self-contained village with neat wooden cabins, small vegetable plots, a general store, a schoolhouse, and even a chapel where traveling preachers came twice a month. To outsiders, it seemed a model of progress, a plantation reborn as a place of opportunity. But beneath this shining surface, resentment brewed. The summer of 1876 was a pivotal moment in America's history. The centennial of its founding, a year of both celebration and bitter reckoning as the promises of Reconstruction frayed. In Kentucky, as throughout the South, white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan were still very much alive, terrorizing black communities and attacking whites who dared to stand beside them as equals. The integrated workforce at Beaumont was an experiment that drew unwanted attention. Harrison Crow, the local newspaper editor, had already written scathing editorials against Jeremiah Beaumont, claiming that the mixing of races and classes was dangerous and unnatural. And then in the middle of that hot summer, 41 lives disappeared forever. Several neighboring plantation owners, still smarting from their losses during the war, watched Jeremiah Beaumont's success with a mix of envy and simmering hatred. Whispers spread through Bourbon County of secret meetings, hooded riders drifting along moonlit roads, and threats carried on the wind. On July 23, 1876, the day began as ordinary as any other at Beaumont Plantation. Before dawn, the 41 workers stirred in their cabins, grabbing tools and stepping out into air so thick with Kentucky heat it felt like wading through syrup. As the pale light crept over the rolling hills, the scent of ripe tobacco leaves wrapped around them, and the calls of mockingbirds mingled with soft conversation as they filed into the fields. Samuel Rutledge, the trusted field supervisor, organized the crews 28 to the eastern fields, where the crop was ready for cutting, 13 to the curing barns to tend the delicate leaves already harvested. By 7 o'clock, all 41 were hard at work. Jeremiah rode his bay mare down the rows, as he did each morning, stopping to exchange a word here and there. He seemed particularly proud that day, pausing beside Samuel to say, "This harvest will set us up for years to come. Every family here will see good money from this season." The sun climbed mercilessly, driving the temperature past 90. But the workers pressed on methodically, cutting and loading the broad golden leaves. Martha Caldwell joked that their sweat would season the tobacco, while Patrick O'Sullivan lifted spirits by singing Irish ballads in a lilting voice that floated above the fields. At noon, the bell called them in, and they gathered beneath the shade of great oaks near the big house, eating cornbread beans and cold buttermilk. Between bites, some spoke of the strangers seen earlier in the week. Grim men in fine dark suits who had passed silently through the plantation roads without so much as a glance. Samuel assumed they were tobacco buyers, but something in the way they carried themselves had gnawed at him. After the break, they returned to the fields and barns, working steadily until the sinking sun lit the tobacco leaves like copper. At dusk, the bell rang again, and as always, they gathered at the store to collect their wages. Jeremiah believed in paying daily, a gesture that bound his people to him. Thomas Vance, meticulous as ever, noted in his journal that every single worker was there at 6:30 to take their pay. With money in their pockets, they drifted back to their cabins, cooked their suppers, and sat on their porches as the night air cooled, talking quietly, laughing, settling into the simple rhythms of life. Then, as darkness deepened, something happened. Something no one could have imagined. By the time the morning bell rang at 5:30 on July 24th, Beaumont Plantation was silent. Not a soul came. The cabins stood open, deserted. Meals sat half-eaten on tables, blankets lay rumpled on beds, children's toys and letters were left behind as if the people had simply evaporated. 41 men, women, and children had disappeared without a trace. Shock ripped through Bourbon County. Jeremiah spurred his horse straight to the county seat in Paris to report what had happened to Sheriff William Danvers, a battle-hardened Civil War veteran. At first, the sheriff waved it off as desertion. "Happens all the time," he said. "Harvest ends, they go looking for better pay." But Jeremiah pushed back. The harvest wasn't over. They'd abandoned weeks of wages, and more chilling, they'd left everything behind. Martha Caldwell's $40 in gold, saved over years, sat untouched under her bed. Patrick O'Sullivan's letters from Boston, his most treasured possession, were scattered across the floor. These were not people who had simply walked away. Inside the empty cabins, children's Sunday clothes still hung neatly on pegs, as if their small owners had simply stepped outside for a moment. Sheriff Danvers wasted no time assembling a search party that combed the plantation and surrounding countryside for 3 long days. What they found only deepened the mystery. Horse tracks told of riders visiting the plantation on the night of July 23rd. But the prints had been deliberately obscured, vanishing beyond the main road. Several cabins showed signs of a sudden, panicked departure chairs. Overturned belongings scattered, while others looked perfectly ordinary beds, still made as though their occupants had dissolved in their sleep. Most chilling of all were the eastern tobacco fields. The tools lay exactly where they had been dropped, lined up in neat rows. But someone had returned to destroy 3 acres of the best tobacco, hacking the plants down and burning them in small, smoldering piles. The sabotage was no accident. It was targeted. On July 27th, just as Danvers began to widen the investigation, beyond Bourbon County Magistrate Edmund Hartwell arrived with an order that changed everything. Hartwell, a powerful landowner with deep political ties, announced that the case was closed. The official story would say that the workers had broken their contracts and fled north, chasing industrial wages in Ohio or Indiana. When Danvers protested, Hartwell laid out a stack of sealed legal papers and claimed that confidential evidence linked the missing workers to criminal activity. For the good of the county, he insisted there would be no further inquiry. Jeremiah Beaumont was shattered. Refusing to accept the whitewashed conclusion, he poured his own fortune into private investigators, then hired the Pinkerton Agency. For weeks, they scoured Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, but came back empty-handed. Their final report, written in September 1876, stated grimly that 41 people do not vanish without leaving a trace, unless someone with extraordinary means wants them gone forever. As months turned to years, the cabins at Beaumont Plantation rotted. Jeremiah never replaced the missing men and women. He could not bear to. The great fields went fallow, and the estate that had once been the pride of Bourbon County fell silent. Theories spread like wildfire in the years that followed. Some said the Ku Klux Klan had murdered them for daring to work side by side, black and white. Others believed they had been kidnapped and sold into secret bondage in the mines. Some whispered that they had stumbled onto something terrible, something someone powerful was desperate to hide. In 1879, a spark of hope surfaced when a drifter swore he had seen Martha Caldwell in a Memphis boarding house. He described her scar, a mark she had carried since childhood. And when officials investigated, they found the boarding house keeper remembered her too. The woman had stayed for 3 days in June, always asking about safe passage to Mexico, paying in gold coins. But one morning, she was gone. This single sighting, unconfirmed and unexplained, was the only trace any of them would ever leave. The mystery might have stayed buried forever, if not for Margaret Beaumont. In 1923, Jeremiah's great-niece, a school teacher from Louisville with a fascination for her family's past, inherited the decaying manor. Determined to restore it, she began peeling away the years of ruin and discovered something hidden. Behind the rotting wallpaper in Jeremiah's old study, sealed in the walls, lay a stack of letters he had hidden shortly before his death in 1881. What Margaret found in those yellowed pages revealed the truth was darker than the county ever whispered. The letters showed that the nightmare at Beaumont had begun months before that July night. Starting early in 1876, Jeremiah had received a series of threats from a shadowy group calling themselves the Kentucky Brotherhood, an alliance of powerful men, landowners, politicians, businessmen, who despised the integrated, successful community he had built. One letter dated May 15, 1876, cut straight to the bone, Mr. Beaumont, your social experiment has gone too far. The mixing of races in positions of equality is an abomination that threatens the natural order. You have been warned before, but you continue to flaunt your disrespect for Southern tradition. The Brotherhood has voted. You will cease these activities immediately or face consequences that will serve as a warning to others. Another letter in June carried an even sharper edge. Your workers have been observed at integrated gatherings. Your operation has become a beacon for radical elements who wish to undermine our way of life. Dissolve your workforce immediately and adopt proper labor practices, or the Brotherhood will take action to protect the interests of this county. Do not mistake this for an idle threat. These were the final words in the last of the letters. Margaret discovered a chilling warning that proved Jeremiah Beaumont knew exactly what kind of danger was closing in on him. Margaret's research revealed that Jeremiah had taken these threats seriously. He had written to the governor of Kentucky asking for protection, a plea that was either intercepted or deliberately ignored, and he had reached out to federal authorities in Louisville. But by 1876, the brief post-war zeal for enforcing civil rights had faded, and no help ever came. Most damning of all was a letter Jeremiah had written to his brother in Virginia just 2 days before the night of the disappearances. "Thomas, I fear I have made a terrible mistake. My attempts to build something good and decent have attracted the attention of men who will stop at nothing to maintain their vision of how things should be. I have tried to protect my workers, but I may have only made them targets. If something happens to me or to them, look for answers among the men who meet in the basement of the Hartwell House on the 3rd Thursday of each month. They call themselves patriots, but they are something far darker." The reference to County Magistrate Edmund Hartwell, the very man who ordered the sheriff to shut down the investigation, sent Margaret digging through dusty courthouse archives for proof. What she found was a chilling pattern stretching across the map of central Kentucky. In the months after the Beaumont disappearances, other farms that had dared to hire integrated workforces suffered a wave of terror, night riders, arson, and contract cancellations that came with no explanation. Every time the investigations were abruptly closed by order of local magistrates. Even more telling, Margaret uncovered that several of the men linked to these closures, including Edmund Hartwell, became inexplicably wealthy in the years that followed. While most landowners in the late 1870s struggled through economic depression, Hartwell somehow acquired 3 additional plantations and nearly 10,000 acres of prime land. Then came Margaret's most important discovery. Beneath a loose board in Jeremiah's bedroom floor lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages covered with coded notes, patiently using the same methodical skill she taught her school children. Margaret began to crack the cipher. What emerged was a horrifying truth. The Kentucky Brotherhood was not just a group of angry bigots. It was a criminal syndicate that used fear, violence, and murder to wipe out competitors and seize their property. Their war against integrated operations, like Beaumont Plantation, was both ideological and profitable. They crushed those who threatened their control of cheap labor and took whatever they left behind. By 1924, Margaret's work was no longer a private family project. It had become dangerous. Anonymous letters arrived warning her to leave the past alone. One night her Louisville apartment was broken into. Her papers were rifled through, but nothing stolen, a silent promise that someone was watching. Soon mail from researchers and historical societies she had contacted began to vanish, intercepted before it could reach her. The final warning came in blood. Margaret had hired a private investigator, Robert Hayes, a former Louisville police detective, to help her trace the surviving families of the vanished workers. Hayes made real progress, piecing together a trail that seemed to be closing in on the truth. Then one morning he was found dead in his office, the coroner calling it a heart attack. The case files he had compiled on the Beaumont mystery were gone. His secretary later swore that 2 well-dressed men had come to see him the day before, insisting he stop his investigation. Undeterred, Margaret pressed on, convinced now more than ever that the 41 souls of Beaumont had not simply vanished. They had been slaughtered, erased by men powerful enough to bury the truth and bold enough to believe that no one would ever dare dig it up again. Her breakthrough came when she tracked down Ezra O'Sullivan, the elderly nephew of Patrick O'Sullivan, one of the missing workers. Living quietly in Boston, Ezra had spent most of his life clinging to his uncle's letters and chasing any whisper of the truth. Among those letters was Patrick's final note to his sister Mary, dated July 20th, 1876, and it sent a chill through Margaret's blood. Dear Mary, something evil is brewing here in Kentucky. Samuel Rutledge told me yesterday that men have been watching the plantation at night, just sitting on horses beyond the tree line. Mr. Beaumont has been short-tempered and anxious, which is not like him. Some of the workers talk about leaving, but the harvest is too close to abandon. The money will set us up for winter. Still, I have a feeling in my bones that something terrible is going to happen. If you do not hear from me, tell the authorities in Boston that Patrick O'Sullivan did not abandon his job willingly. It was the first written proof that the danger had been known and felt before the terrible night. But Ezra had one more secret one he had carried since 1891. 15 years after the disappearance, a stranger came to his door. The man refused to give his name, but said he knew what had become of the missing 41. He told Ezra they had been murdered on the night of July 23, 1876, and their bodies hidden so carefully they would never be found. He claimed he had been there bound by an oath of silence, but that guilt had been gnawing at him for years. Before vanishing back into the streets, he left Ezra with a cryptic clue. If you want to find where they rest, look for the place where the tobacco grows tallest, where the soil is richest, where the limestone runs deepest. Margaret realized the meaning almost at once. There had always been a section of the eastern fields known for its unnaturally tall tobacco. With the help of agricultural experts, she began sampling soil across the plantation. Their tests led her back to the same eastern fields, where the crop had been cut down and burned immediately after the disappearances. The soil there was different, thicker, with phosphorus and nitrogen richer than any surrounding ground, its fertility a silent marker of something long buried beneath. As Margaret prepared to dig, her work was suddenly halted. Harrison Hartwell, son of the late Edmund Hartwell and heir to his power, arrived with 2 attorneys and a court order from Lexington forbidding any further excavation on the property. Cloaked as historical preservation, the order was, in truth, a barrier, a desperate attempt to keep the truth entombed. But Margaret now knew she was closer than ever. The conspiracy was unraveling, and she would not stop. Her determination led her to a final ally, Elias Rutledge, the elderly grandson of Samuel Rutledge. Elias had grown up with whispers of that night, a family burden too heavy for anyone to speak aloud. On a cold December evening in 1924, in a modest hotel room in Paris, Kentucky, the 73-year-old sat trembling across from Margaret as snow fell outside, muffling the world. For an hour, he said nothing caught between his oath and his conscience. At last he spoke, his voice a frail whisper. "Miss Beaumont, there are some burdens that get heavier with time, not lighter. My grandmother made me swear I would never tell what she saw that night. But I can't take this to my grave. Those good people are lying in unmarked dirt, while the men who killed them built mansions with their blood." As Margaret leaned forward, her pulse hammering, Elias began to recount what his grandmother Rebecca had told him. On the night of the massacre, she had not been at Beaumont. She had been in Lexington tending to a dying sister. That absence had saved her life. She returned on the morning of July 24th, expecting to find her husband and the workers already in the fields. Instead, she found a silence so thick it made her skin crawl. The cabin's gaped open doors hanging loose like mouths in a scream. Toys lay scattered in the dust. Pots of grits sat abandoned on cold fires. Coffee spilled across tables as if people had been torn away mid-motion. Rebecca had been born into slavery on a Virginia plantation, her instincts honed by a lifetime of danger. That morning, those instincts told her one thing: hide first, then look. Instead of calling out for her husband or heading toward the main house, Rebecca slipped into the dense band of trees skirting the eastern fields and hid herself deep in the undergrowth, waiting for the plantation to reveal its secrets. What she saw over the next few hours scarred her soul forever. As the morning sun burned higher, thickening the Kentucky air into a suffocating haze, a slow procession of wagons emerged from the eastern fields. These were not the usual farm wagons used to haul tobacco. These were heavy freight wagons with reinforced beds and canvas draped tightly over their loads. The drivers were strangers to her, but the men who rode at their sides were not. At the head of the column was County Magistrate Edmund Hartwell, his immaculate clothes smeared with dirt and something darker. Close behind came Judge Cornelius Vandenberg from the courthouse, Mayor Samuel Preston of Paris, and Dr. Hiram Caldwell, the county's most trusted physician, a man Rebecca had once believed to be above reproach. Seeing these pillars of the community stained and grim leading wagons away from the plantation filled her with a cold dread unlike anything she had endured in slavery or war. She crouched low as they passed, counting at least 8 wagons each, weighted down, their contents hidden. The men rode with their heads close together, speaking in low tones. But the still heavy air carried fragments of their words. The northern route arrangements in Louisville, and most chilling of all, no traces left behind. When the wagons finally disappeared down the main road, Rebecca's relief was short-lived. Another group of men rode in these not gentlemen but hard-eyed, rough-handed enforcers who moved with swift, ruthless purpose. She watched frozen as they began erasing everything. One by one they entered the cabins, ransacking them, with practiced precision, burning letters and documents in a roaring fire behind the main house. Clothes and personal effects were thrown into smaller wagons and carted away. Then came the buckets of a white powder lime Rebecca would later realize scattered across floors and earth to wipe away every biological trace that might have remained. This was no spontaneous act of violence. It was a cleanup, a cover-up executed with cold military discipline. They knew exactly where to look, what to take, and how to erase 41 lives as though they had never been. The moment that broke her came when a group of men returned from the eastern fields, carrying tools and clothing soaked in blood. They tossed them into the fire, and the stench of burning cloth, mixed with something far more terrible, drifted across the plantation, reaching even her hidden place. The smell told her everything. Her husband, and every man, woman, and child she knew were dead, buried somewhere in those fields she had walked 100 times before. But her horror was not over. As the afternoon wore on, the final act of the conspiracy unfolded before her eyes. Around 3 o'clock, Jeremiah Beaumont rode in from Paris, his horse lathered in sweat, and she saw instantly that he knew nothing. The shock on his face as he rushed from cabin to cabin, calling for his workers, was raw and real. He was still searching when Hartwell appeared with the other men, calm, as if the morning's horrors had never happened. Rebecca couldn't hear everything, but she caught enough to understand that Hartwell was feeding him a ready-made story, that the workers had been threatened by vigilantes and fled in the night, abandoning their contracts. She saw Hartwell produce documents neatly folded and signed, proving that the workers had left of their own accord. Jeremiah protested, furious and grief-stricken. But Hartwell's measured tone never faltered, promising an investigation, even as the silent looks passing between him and the others told a different truth. From her vantage point, Rebecca could see it all the way the men arranged themselves around Jeremiah, the way they guided the conversation, each nod and glance silently rehearsed. And in that moment she understood that whatever chance for justice had once existed for her husband and the others was already gone. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, Rebecca understood with bone-deep certainty that she was in mortal danger. If the men discovered her, she would not live to tell anyone what she had seen. Moving like a shadow, she began to slip deeper into the woods, careful to keep low and silent. That was when she heard voices, two of the rough-looking men leaning against the trees, not far from where she crouched, smoking and talking with the easy callousness of men who had done something monstrous and thought little of it. One grumbled about the back-breaking work of the day. The other laughed his words as cold as the steel he carried. 41 bodies don't bury themselves, especially when you've got to dig deep enough they'll never be found. But the pay is good. And the boss says this kind of work keeps the colored folks and their white friends in line. Nothing like a whole crew disappearing to make people think twice about getting too uppity. The first man chuckled, and his reply froze Rebecca where she crouched. The lime will take care of any evidence, and by next spring, this will be the richest tobacco ground in Kentucky. Fitting, ain't it? The ones who thought they were too good to know their place will end up fertilizing the crops that make their betters rich. In that moment, every nightmare was confirmed. Her husband Samuel and all the others lay beneath the very fields where they had toiled. Buried deep, their final resting place, disguised as the most fertile land on the plantation. Rebecca stayed hidden until well past midnight, waiting until the last wagon wheels and hoofbeats had faded into the distance. Then she crept out of the woods and began the long walk to Lexington on foot. She did not go back to her cabin. She knew that if the conspirators suspected anyone had escaped, they would be watching. Her sister's illness became her shield. No one questioned why she was in Lexington, and in that chaos she disappeared. In the days that followed, she realized the reach of the men she had seen that day. When Sheriff Danvers began his investigation, she considered telling him everything, but before she could make her move, two well-dressed men appeared at her door. They spoke in polite, measured tones, never raising their voices, but their message was clear as a gun barrel. They knew who she was. They knew what she had witnessed. And they were watching her. They suggested that life might be safer for her somewhere far away. Maybe Cincinnati, maybe further north. They even offered her money for travel expenses. It was not a gift. It was a price. Rebecca took the money not because she wanted it, but because she understood that if she stayed in Kentucky, she would die. She fled to Cincinnati and built a new life as a domestic servant. Outwardly, she became another anonymous black woman in a northern city. Inwardly, she carried a wound that never healed. She never saw Samuel again, but she never forgot. And in time, she began to record everything she had seen, writing out in painful detail the sequence of that terrible day, drawing maps of the plantation listing the names of every man she recognized. She hid these records away, vowing that one day, if the chance ever came, someone would tell the truth. Before she died in 1902, she swore her son to carry the story and the evidence to pass it down, until the day came when it was safe to speak. Now, in the cold winter of 1924, her grandson Elias had decided that day had come. As he finished speaking in that quiet hotel room, his weathered face wet with tears, he looked Margaret Beaumont in the eye. "Miss Beaumont," He said, his voice trembling but steady. My grandmother spent her whole life carrying the weight of what she saw. She died believing that justice would never come from my grandfather and the others. But maybe if we are brave enough to speak the truth now, we can finally give them peace. Then he revealed the rest. Hidden in the basement of his modest house was everything Rebecca had written: her maps, her list of names, her diagrams of the eastern fields, and her precise account of that day. Margaret leafed through those yellowed pages with a sense of awe and dread. The evidence was devastating. It proved beyond doubt that the 41 men, women, and children had been slaughtered in a single night and buried in the very fields they had once harvested. And the names Rebecca wrote were not just local farmers. They included judges, mayors, business leaders, and the county's highest officials. The Kentucky Brotherhood, it turned out, was no mere secret society. It was a regional machine, a network of men who used terror and murder to maintain power and property, shielded by the very laws they swore to uphold. Margaret understood now that the massacre at Beaumont was not just a single act of hate. It was a message, a warning to anyone who believed in a different kind of future. The decision to eliminate the Beaumont plantation workers was made months before that sweltering July in a smoke-filled meeting room in Louisville in May 1876. Representatives from Brotherhood chapters across Kentucky and neighboring states gathered around a long table. Their plan as cold and deliberate as any military campaign. Beaumont had become a dangerous symbol, proof that an integrated workforce could succeed in the South without chains, without fear, without the old order. If Jeremiah Beaumont's experiment thrived, others might follow, and the Brotherhood's grip on labor and power would weaken. So they resolved to destroy it. Every detail of the massacre was planned. The date was chosen for the peak of the harvest, when no one would willingly leave, and the loss would cause the most financial ruin. The place was selected carefully, the isolated eastern fields far from the house and the road where no one could see what was coming. And most chilling of all, Margaret Beaumont would later learn that Beaumont was only one chapter in a long, bloody ledger. Rebecca Rutledge's secret records revealed that the Brotherhood had been orchestrating such acts of terror for decades, targeting integrated workforces, outspoken Republicans, civil rights advocates, and anyone who dared to threaten the social order they worshipped. Murder was a tool of business. They wrote everything down, every victim, every operation, keeping ledgers as if they were counting bales of tobacco instead of lives. That knowledge explained the fierce resistance Margaret faced almost 50 years later when she began to investigate. The same families who had ordered the slaughter in 1876 still sat in positions of influence, and they were determined to bury the past at any cost. But Rebecca's hidden testimony gave Margaret more than just a story. It gave her proof. The names of the men who planned and carried out the killings, the very spot where the bodies were buried, the documents that could finally rip open the conspiracy. For the first time in nearly half a century, justice seemed possible. In the brutal winter of 1924 and 1925, knowing how dangerous her discovery was, Margaret worked in secret, making copies of every document, every note of Rebecca's testimony, and sending them far from Kentucky's reach to historical societies in Boston and Chicago, civil rights groups in New York and Philadelphia, journalists in distant cities where the Brotherhood's shadow could not reach. But she knew that evidence alone would never be enough. The Brotherhood had survived precisely because it controlled the very courts and sheriffs that should have punished it. Margaret needed allies who were beyond the Brotherhood's influence. She found them in the Justice Department. For years, a small, stubborn group of federal investigators had been quietly tracking organized terror across the South, even as the rest of the country looked away. One of them, Special Agent Franklin Morrison in Louisville, had spent years collecting whispers of violence against African Americans and those who dared to work beside them. When Margaret placed Rebecca's evidence on his desk, Morrison immediately understood what he was looking at. This was a window into something bigger than anything he had ever dared to imagine. Over the next 2 years, Morrison's team uncovered the full scale of the Brotherhood's network. It wasn't just Kentucky. It stretched across the South, a hidden empire built on fear and murder. They learned that the group was an evolution of the Ku Klux Klan, but leaner, smarter, embedded deep within state politics, using meticulous records and ruthless discipline to control everything from the courts to the farms. They documented hundreds of murders, thousands of acts of terror, and the careful corruption of local government. And at the heart of it all lay the Beaumont Massacre, one of the Brotherhood's most thoroughly recorded crimes, preserved only because Rebecca had risked everything to write it down. Her courage and Margaret's relentless pursuit gave the federal government the case it had been waiting for. In 1926, grand juries in Louisville, Lexington, and Frankfort returned indictments against 47 of the most powerful men in the state among them. Sitting judges, county officials, and wealthy businessmen. The charges ranged from conspiracy to commit murder to federal civil rights violations. The trials that began in 1927 were unlike anything Kentucky had ever seen, and for the first time in decades, the hidden empire of the Brotherhood faced the light. For the first time, the full machinery of post-Reconstruction terror was laid bare in a courtroom. Witness after witness described a system of organized violence that had been whispered about for decades, but never proven. The Beaumont trials did more than uncover the details of one massacre. They exposed the entire network of fear that had gripped the South since the Civil War. County Magistrate Harrison Hartwell, crushed by the evidence that tied his own father to the plot, chose to cooperate with federal prosecutors. His testimony was a revelation. Hartwell described in chilling detail how his father had received explicit orders from the Brotherhood's leaders in Louisville to eliminate the Beaumont workforce as an example to warn anyone tempted to follow Jeremiah Beaumont's experiment in racial cooperation. Every step of the slaughter had been mapped out months in advance. Timing, logistics, even the paperwork to make sure that the disappearance of the workers would appear voluntary. And then came the most damning revelation of all: the Brotherhood had treated murder like business. Hartwell admitted that the group kept ledgers tracking the costs of violence, as if they were simply calculating profits and losses. The killings were considered a profitable investment that would preserve their power and protect their economic advantage. As the trial unspooled, the depth of the conspiracy came into focus. Judges who quietly dismissed charges, sheriffs who refused to investigate obvious crimes, politicians who blocked reform. Every branch of the state's authority had been bent to serve the Brotherhood. For decades, they had operated with total impunity. But that era was ending. While federal prosecutors presented their evidence, Margaret Beaumont worked alongside investigators to fulfill a promise. Using Rebecca's maps and old testimony, a search began in the eastern fields of the abandoned plantation. In the soft clay soil, they found the grave. It was a pit carefully dug half a century earlier, meant to hide the crime forever. As archaeologists worked in silence, they unearthed the remains of the 41 men, women and children who had vanished in 1876. There was no longer any doubt. They had been murdered and buried where no one would find them. Each set of remains was documented with care, personal effects recovered when possible, and at long last, the dead were given dignity, In a cemetery in Paris, Kentucky, headstones were placed with their names, and a monument was erected so their lives would not vanish from memory a second time. The memorial drew hundreds. Descendants came from across the country to stand where the truth had finally come to light. Civil rights leaders spoke about justice delayed and the cost of forgetting. Margaret Beaumont stood among them, refusing praise and pointing instead to Rebecca Rutledge, whose bravery had made this day possible. The trials ended with convictions for 31 of the 47 accused. The worst of them were sentenced to life. Others faced decades in prison. Several conspirators fled or died before trial, but the organization they had built was shattered. The Kentucky Brotherhood, as a formal power structure, was no more. Its exposure shook the nation. The Beaumont case became a catalyst for renewed federal efforts to confront organized terror in the South. It led to stronger civil rights legislation and inspired investigators in other states to dig into their own histories of violence and corruption. Margaret devoted the rest of her life to making sure the victims would not be forgotten. She founded the Beaumont Memorial Foundation, which offered scholarships to descendants of the murdered workers, funded research into post-Reconstruction violence, and safeguarded the archive of evidence. She ensured the records did not simply preserve cold facts, they told the stories of lives cut short, of families torn apart, of a community erased. Margaret traveled across the country, speaking to schools, universities, and civic groups, teaching what had happened in Bourbon County and why it mattered. Her efforts reached far beyond Kentucky, helping to build a more complete understanding of the terror that shaped the South after the Civil War. The Beaumont plantation itself was eventually transformed into a place of remembrance. The workers' cabins, carefully restored, now stand as exhibits, their interiors telling the stories of the 41 who once lived there. And in the eastern fields, where they had been buried in secret, a memorial garden spreads out beneath the Kentucky sky, with paths and markers to guide visitors through the history of the land. A place where the silence that once hid a crime now speaks at last of truth.